This podcast is brought to you by LMU Munich.
Welcome to this lecture, and I will just introduce you to the third and last lecture of Robert Brandom, and he will talk this night about the last part, the ending passages of the introduction, and the title is Following the Path of Despair, or the Bacchanalian Revel, the emergence of the second true object. Please.
Well, I know that those of you who have stayed with me this long are really serious about this stuff, so I appreciate it. So Hegel opens the introduction to the Phenomenology by considering an epistemological picture according to which our cognitive faculties are regarded as the instrument through which one takes hold of the absolute or the medium through which one discovers it. Philosophers otherwise as diverse as Descartes, Locke, and Kant can be seen to work with versions of this picture. And it seems clear that Hegel thinks we need to break out of the confines of this way of thinking about things that he nonetheless calls natural. In my first lecture, I tried to say why and to indicate in general terms the shape of the new picture that he's going to recommend to succeed this traditional one. The broadest form of his objection is that theories of the kind he's complaining about make us patsies for skepticism. More specifically, he thinks that traditional modern epistemology is conducted within the scope of semantic assumptions that make it impossible in the end to satisfy what I called the genuine knowledge condition. This is the requirement that an epistemological theory not make it unintelligible that, at least when all things go well, how things appear to us is how they really are. In his terms, that how things are for consciousness can be how things are in themselves. I argued that the crucial feature of the class of theories that he takes to fail this requirement, by precluding the intelligibility of genuine knowledge, is not that they construe the relation between appearance and reality in representational terms. It is that they take the termini of the relation to be characterized by a structural difference. Representing appearances are construed as conceptually articulated, while represented realities are not. Theories with this shape excavate a gulf of intelligibility, separating knowing from the known, mind from world. Now, of all the differences there might be between how the known world objectively is and how the knowing subject represents it, why should one think that this possible difference makes such a difference? Why would it matter if thought, but not the world thought about, is construed as coming in conceptual shape? Hegel's working in a Kantian idiom in which there's an internal connection between conceptual articulation and understanding. Concepts are the form of apperceptive awareness. So what can be understood, what is intelligible, just is what's in conceptual shape. Hegel thinks that unless the picture has it that we can understand how things really are, any relation we assert between those realities and the appearances we can understand or grasp must itself be unintelligible. No relation to what is ultimately and intrinsically unintelligible, because not conceptually articulated, could count as a cognitive relation. It could not be the basis for an account of knowing that makes sense of the possibility of genuine knowledge. This is the problem with the idea of, quote, getting the truth in its purity simply by subtracting from the result the instrument's part in that representation of the absolute which we have gained through it, end of the quote. The result of subtracting its conceptual form from our understanding would be something unintelligible. We cannot understand the relation between what's intelligible and what's not intelligible for the simple reason that we can't understand what's not intelligible. A picture of that sort can't satisfy the genuine knowledge condition. Also in my first lecture, I suggested that the key to the alternative picture Hegel wants to put in place lies in the non-psychological conception of the conceptual he introduces and develops in the consciousness section of the Phenomenology. According to this conception, conceptual contents are articulated by relations of material incompatibility, his determinate negation, or exclusive difference, that is, Aristotelian contrariety. This line of thought begins with an understanding of determinateness that applies equally to thoughts and things. It's codified in Spinoza's dictum, omnis determinatio est negatio. Both that there is some determinate way the world is, and that a thought has determinate content, are to be understood in terms of what possibilities they exclude. A state of affairs whose obtaining would rule out the obtaining of no other, a thought whose truth would rule out the truth of no other, would be indeterminate, unbestimmt. The kind of negation in terms of which determination is understood in Hegel's version of Spinoza's thought is that characterizing relations of what he calls exclusive, ausschließend difference, as opposed to indifferent, gleichgültig difference. That is, it's the relation between circular and triangular, not that between circular and red. This way of understanding the metaphysics of determinateness is by no means idiosyncratic to Hegel. Besides its Spinozist and indeed scholastic antecedents, it's the master idea behind contemporary information theory, which understands the information conveyed by a signal in terms of the possibilities its receipt excludes for its recipient. And it can be understood as another way of expressing the understanding of a proposition as a partition of possible worlds into those compatible and those incompatible with its truth. But still, what warrant is there for thinking of this metaphysical conception of determinateness in terms of material incompatibility as a conception of the conceptual? Justifying that identification requires giving an account of two defining characteristics of the conceptual. First, one must show how to justify in its terms the Kantian identification of intelligibility in terms of conceptual form, by saying what it is to grasp or understand something that is in conceptual form, in this sense of conceptual form. Second, one must show how what is conceptually contentful in this sense also exhibits representational purport. These correspond to the two dimensions of intentionality I distinguished last time, that intentionality and of intentionality, what one can think and say, and what one would thereby be thinking or talking about. My second lecture addressed exactly these two issues. Starting with the notion of conceptual contents as articulated by relations of material incompatibility, it showed both what one must do in order thereby to count as cognitively grasping such contents, and how doing that amounts to practically acknowledging the representational purport of those contents. Grasping or understanding a conceptual content is engaging in a process of experience. This is Hegel's successor conception to Kantian apperception. For Kant, what one must do in order to apperceive, to be cognitively aware, is to judge. Judging, in turn, is understood as rationally integrating a commitment into a developing whole that exhibits the distinctive synthetic unity of apperception. That unity is a rational unity, with critical, ampliative, and justificatory dimensions corresponding to the normative obligation to extrude materially incompatible commitments, acknowledge material consequences, and assess justificatory credentials. The contents commitments must possess in order to be subject to these rational normative obligations must, accordingly, stand in relations of material incompatibility and consequence to other such contents. Grasping or understanding such a content is practically being able to distinguish what's materially incompatible with it, what it conceptually excludes, what's a material consequence of it, what it conceptually includes, and what it's a material consequence of, what conceptually includes it. And that's just to say that it's necessary and sufficient to be graspable in this sense, to be apperceivable, that the contents be determinate in the sense of standing to one another in relations of determinate negation, and so mediation. What's determinate in this sense is in conceptual form in Hegel's sense. In his introduction, Hegel focuses on one dimension of the process of apperceptive experience, the experience of error. This sort of experience is occasioned by finding oneself with materially incompatible commitments. Practically acknowledging the error is exercising one's critical task responsibility to repair it, removing the incompatibility by relinquishing or modifying at least one of the jointly incompatible commitments. In the previous lecture, I explained how it is in the experience of error that representational purport is practically taken up. That is, the determinate, hence conceptually contentful commitments, are taken or treated as representations, as appearances of some reality. For incompatible commitments must have a common topic. If two properties are incompatible, what's impossible is that they should be exhibited by one and the same object. If one attributes incompatible properties to two different objects, one has not yet made a mistake. To take it that one has made a mistake, that the commitments are incompatible, is to take them to refer to or represent one and the same object. In the second phase of the experience of error, a subject responds to the acknowledgement of error by fulfilling the critical task responsibility of repairing the incoherence by amending or discarding one of the commitments. Doing that is treating the amended or discarded commitment as a mere appearance, and the retained and resulting commitments as expressing how things really are. In this way, through the experience of error, the distinction between what things are in themselves, reality, and what things are merely for consciousness, appearance, itself becomes something to consciousness. That distinction is practically implicit in the process that is the experience of error. That's how consciousness incorporates as a basic aspect of the structure of its functioning a practical appreciation of its determinate subjective commitments as purporting to represent how things really objectively are. It treats its commitments as about things in the sense of answering to how things are in themselves for the correctness of how things are for it. So Hegel's Spinozist concept of determinateness in terms of articulation by relations of modally robust exclusion, material incompatibility, or determinate negation, meets the principal requirements for a metaconcept of conceptual contentfulness. It makes sense of what it is to grasp a conceptual content and of what it is for such contents to have a representational dimension. Furthermore, the way these two criteria of adequacy are satisfied are deeply connected. In the context of Hegel's structural critique of traditional modern epistemology, the key explanatory virtue of this non-psychological conception of the conceptual is that it applies not only to subjective thoughts, but to objective facts. For both are determinate. They're determinate ways consciousness takes things to be, and they're determinate ways things are. And both in virtue of standing in relations of material incompatibility to other ways one could take things to be, or things could be. But the subjective and objective senses of material incompatibility are not the same. If two states of affairs are materially incompatible, then it's impossible for both to obtain. But if two thoughts or judgments are materially incompatible, it does not at all follow that it's impossible for one subject to be simultaneously committed to both. It only follows that the subject ought not to be so committed, that such a subject is obliged to do something to change the situation, to fulfill the standing critical task responsibility to rectify the situation by eliminating the incoherence. On the side of objects, incompatibility of properties is an alethic modal matter of impossibility. On the side of subjects, incompatibility of commitments is a deontic normative matter of impropriety. But the notion of material incompatibility or determinate negation that comes in these two flavors is not simply ambiguous. For what one must do in order thereby to count as practically taking or treating two objective properties or states of affairs as objectively incompatible is precisely to treat the corresponding commitments as normatively incompatible, in the sense that finding oneself with both obliges one to change one's commitments in acknowledgement of an error. Treating two commitments as incompatible in the deontic normative sense is representing two properties or states of affairs as incompatible in the alethic modal sense. What one must do in order to manifest practically one's grasp or understanding of conceptual contents is suitably engage with them in the practice or process of experience, especially the experience of error, by fulfilling one's obligation to resolve acknowledged incompatibilities. Doing that is treating incompatible commitments as representing incompatible states of affairs. The relation between the sense of materially incompatible that's articulated by deontic normative relations of what one is obliged or entitled to do on the subjective side of representings, what things are for consciousness, and the sense that's articulated by alethic modal relations of what's necessary and possible on the objective side of representeds, what things are in themselves, is one of reciprocal sense dependence. It's not that there cannot be objective properties and states of affairs standing in relations of modal incompatibility to one another unless there are representings of them. It is rather that one cannot understand what one is saying or thinking in saying or thinking that they stand in such relations, except as part of a story that includes what subjects who represent them as so standing, by practically acknowledging their normative obligation to do something to repair the situation when they find themselves with commitments to objects having incompatible properties, or to incompatible states of affairs more generally. This relation of reciprocal sense dependence is responsible for the Janus-faced character of Hegel's metaconcept of determinate negation. On the one hand, it characterizes the alethic modal relations that, as Kant taught, structure the objective world. On the other hand, it characterizes the norm-governed subjective process or practice that is experience, which is always, inter alia, the experience of error. In this latter aspect, it's not a matter of static relations, but a dynamic principle of movement, change, and development. That one cannot understand the most fundamental structure of the objective world apart from understanding what one must do to represent things as being so is an essential element of Hegel's idealism. One can put the point by saying that objective substances no less than subjects, things no less than thoughts, as determinate, are essentially conceptually structured. But unless one keeps in mind the complex fine structure of Hegel's Janus-faced non-psychological conception of the conceptual in terms of determinateness as articulated by material incompatibility of the two kinds, one will not understand what's meant by such a claim. Now, the greatest hermeneutic challenge in reading the introduction lies in the 3 paragraphs that precede the final one. For here, Hegel makes 2 claims that are surprising enough to be worth quoting at length, and you'll find these on the handout. The first is introduced with the observation that we've put ourselves in a position to understand that in the experience of error, the subject, consciousness, quote, is consciousness of what is to it, the true, and consciousness of its knowledge of this truth. Since both are for consciousness, consciousness itself is their comparison. Whether its knowledge of the object corresponds or fails to correspond with this object will be a matter for consciousness itself. End of the quote. The subject assesses the material compatibility of its commitments, exercising its critical rational task responsibility as a judger. Where an incompatibility is found, a choice must be made. One commitment can still be endorsed as presenting how things really are, in themselves, but then others must be unmasked as mere appearances. They're now implicitly or practically treated, that's the to it, as only presenting how things are for consciousness. Recall here the crucial distinction, which as I pointed out in the second lecture, Hegel marks grammatically between what things are implicitly to consciousness, uses the dative ihm, and what they are explicitly for consciousness. In the example from the last lecture, seeing its behavior when the half-immersed stick is fully removed from the water, the subject discards her commitment to its being bent and substitutes a commitment to its being straight. It's only slightly hyperbolic to say that the consciousness that is the subject of this experience is their comparison. Quote, Hegel says, something is to it the in itself, but the knowledge or the being of the object for consciousness is to it still another moment. It's upon this differentiation, which exists and is present at hand, that the examination, the Prüfung, is grounded. And if, in this comparison, the 2 moments do not correspond, then it seems that consciousness will have to alter its knowledge in order to bring it into accord with the object. End of the quote. That is, after the discordance has been repaired and material incompatibility restored, the appearance, what things are for consciousness, should, as far as consciousness is concerned, to consciousness, have been brought in line with the reality, what things are in themselves. But that's not how Hegel wants us to understand and talk about what happens in such experience. He says, quote, in the alteration of the knowledge, however, the object itself becomes to consciousness something which has in fact been altered as well. For the knowledge which existed was essentially a knowledge of the object. With change in the knowledge, the object also becomes an other, since it was an essential part of this knowledge. Hence, it comes to pass for consciousness that what has been to it, the in itself, is not in itself, or what was in itself was so only for consciousness. When, therefore, consciousness finds its knowledge not corresponding with its object, the object itself will also give way. In other words, the standard, Maßstab, of the examination is changed if that whose standard it was supposed to be fails to endure the course of the examination. Thus, the examination is not only an examination of knowledge, but also of the standard used in the examination itself. End of the quote. Now, this is very odd. Why should we think that when a commitment a subject took to express how things really are, a presentation of how things are in themselves, is what it was to the subject, when such a commitment is revealed as expressing merely how things are for consciousness, why should we think that the reality changes? When I realize that the stick I took to be bent is really straight, my view of the stick changes, but the stick itself does not. That I took it to be bent is not, in our ordinary way of thinking, an essential feature of the stick, the object. Surely the contrary claim does not follow from what one might justifiably claim, that its object, the stick, was an essential feature of the appearance, the stick is bent. The stick serves as a standard for assessment of the correctness of my commitments as to its shape. But in what sense does that standard change when I realize that my shape commitment does not measure up to the standard, that it gets it wrong? Hegel's claim here seems extravagant and perverse. And the argument that he offers, he says, quote, "For the knowledge which existed was essentially, wesentlich, a knowledge of the object. With change in the knowledge, the object also becomes an other, because it was an essential part of this knowledge." That argument appears to trade on an obviously unwarranted slide. Even if we grant that what it's a claim about, what it represents, is essential to the identity of the claim, so that altering the represented object would alter the content of the claim, it just does not follow that the content of the claim is correspondingly essential to the identity of the represented object, so that altering the content of the claim alters the object. Being essential to is not in general a symmetric relation. So, for instance, we might think that the identity of my parents is essential to my identity. Anyone with different people as parents would be someone different from me. It's not possible for me to have had different people as parents. But when we look at the converse, it does seem possible that my parents might never have had any children, or only had some of the children they did, not including me. Essentiality of origins of humans does not entail essentiality of offspring. It's easy to see Hegel here as engaging in a sleight of hand, attempting to smuggle in unobserved an implausible idealism that makes what's thought about it essential to the identity of what's thought about. But as we'll see, that would be to misunderstand the claim that he's making. The second surprising claim is introduced as part of an account of the basic structure of experience in the distinctive technical sense Hegel introduces here. Quote, "This dialectical movement, which consciousness exercises on itself, on its knowledge as well as its object, is, insofar as the new, true object emerges to consciousness as the result of it, precisely that which is called experience." End of the quote. The challenge posed by the earlier passage is echoed here. How are we to understand the movement which consciousness exercises on the object of its knowledge? The key question will turn out to be this. When commitment to the stick as bent is discarded and replaced by commitment to the stick as straight, what exactly is the new, true object? Answering this question correctly is integral to understanding the sense in which, on Hegel's account, the representational purport of conceptually contentful commitments is itself something to consciousness, implicit in its own process of experience. In order to understand the justification for saying that the experience of error changes not only how the subject is committed to things being, the stick is now taken to be straight, not bent, that is, what he calls consciousness as knowledge, but also the object of that knowledge, the essential point to realize is that the new true object which he says emerges to consciousness, is not the straight stick. After all, it didn't change. It was straight all along. Hegel describes the experience like this, quote, consciousness knows something, and this object is the essence or the in itself. But this object is also the in itself for consciousness, and hence the ambiguity of this truth comes into play. We see that consciousness now has two objects. One is the first in itself, and the second is the being for consciousness of this in itself. The latter seems at first to be merely the reflection of consciousness into itself, a representation not of an object, but only of its knowledge of the first object. But as already indicated, the first object comes to be altered for consciousness in this very process. It ceases to be the in itself and becomes to consciousness an object which is the in itself only for it. And therefore it follows that this, the being for consciousness of this in itself, is the true, which is to say that this true is the essence or consciousness's new object. This new object contains the annihilation of the first. It is the experience constituted through the first object. Close quote. The first thing to notice, I think, is that the first object is described as the first in itself. That implies that there's at least another in itself. But there's only one real stick, and it's straight. The key to understanding this is that what's at issue here is the role something can play in experience. The role in question is being an in itself to consciousness. To be an in itself to consciousness is to be what consciousness practically takes or treats as real. At the beginning of the experience, the subject in question endorses the claim that the stick is bent. That's what the subject takes to be real. That bent stick commitment expresses the first in itself to consciousness, how it initially takes things really objectively to be. The second in itself to consciousness is expressed by the later straight stick endorsement. But what then is the second object being talked about in these passages? It's not the straight stick. That's the second in itself to consciousness. Hegel says here that the second object is the being for consciousness of the first in itself. What does that mean? When he introduces the movement of experience in the previous paragraph, Hegel says, quote, hence it comes to pass for consciousness that what had been to it, the in itself, is not in itself, or what was in itself was so only for consciousness. End of the quote. What the subject discovers is that what it had taken to express the way things really are, the stick is bent, actually only expresses an appearance. The role the bent stick representation plays for consciousness, what it is to consciousness, has changed. It, quote, becomes to consciousness an object which is the in itself only for it, end of the quote. What he calls the new true object is the bent stick representation revealed as erroneous, as a misrepresentation of what is now to the subject the way things really are, a straight stick. This representing is true, not in the sense of representing how things really are, but in the sense that what it is now to consciousness is what it really is, a mere appearance, a misrepresenting. That's why, quote, this new object contains the annihilation of the first. It is the experience constituted through that first object, end of the quote. This is the sense in which, quote, in the alteration of knowledge, the object itself becomes to consciousness, something which has in fact been altered as well, close quote. What alters is the status of the bent stick representing, what it is to consciousness. It had enjoyed the status of being to consciousness what the stick is in itself. But now its status has changed to being to consciousness only what the stick was for consciousness, an appearance. Understanding that the two objects are the bent stick representation when it was endorsed and the bent stick representation when it's no longer endorsed, we're now in a position to see that on our first reading, we misunderstood, quote, knowledge of the object in the argument, quote, for the knowledge which existed was essentially a knowledge of the object, With change in the knowledge, the object also becomes an other, since it was an essential part of this knowledge." Close quote. What is knowledge to consciousness is what's endorsed, what the subject practically or implicitly takes to be how things really are. What has to consciousness the status of knowledge changes in the course of the experience, from being the stick is bent to the stick is straight. That was knowledge of the object, not in the sense in which a representing is of something represented, but in the sense that the status, being to consciousness knowledge, was possessed or exhibited by the object, the bent stick representation. That the status was possessed by that object, the conceptual content, is indeed essential to that knowing. When the status attaches to something else, a straight stick representation, it is in a straightforward sense a different knowing. What object, here crucially in the sense of what conceptual content it attaches to, is essential to its being that knowing. Altering the knowing by endorsing a different incompatible content alters the status of the original content, and so alters what he calls the object associated with the original knowing. Its status changes from being a conceptual content that's endorsed to being one that's rejected. Now, I think Hegel could have usefully avoided confusion here, either by not introducing this new sense of object of knowledge to mean not what's represented by the knowledge, but the conceptual content of the knowledge, or by explaining that that's how he's using the term in this passage. But he doesn't help us out with that. But so read, the first originally surprising claim becomes so no longer. The second surprising claim is one that Hegel himself flags as such. He says, quote, "In this presentation of the course of experience, there's a moment in virtue of which it does not seem to be in agreement with the ordinary use of the term experience. This moment is the transition from the first object and the knowledge of that object to the other object." Now remember, I'm saying the first object is the bent stick representation as endorsed, and the second object is that same bent stick representation as rejected. Although it's said that the experience is made in this other object, here the transition has been presented in such a way that the knowledge of the first object, or the being for consciousness of the first in itself, is seen to become the second object itself. By contrast, it usually seems that we somehow discover another object in a manner quite accidental and extraneous, and that we experience in it the untruth of our first concept. What would fall to us on this ordinary view of experience is therefore simply the pure apprehension of what exists in and for itself. From the viewpoint of the present investigation, however, the new object shows itself as having come into being through an inversion of consciousness itself. He wants us to focus on the activity of deciding to reject the bent stick representation and accept the straight stick one. So here Hegel is explicitly acknowledging that there's a danger of being misled by the way he has described the experience of error. He explicitly confirms the reading I've been offering. The second, the new true object, is, he says, quote, "the being for consciousness of the first in itself." The inversion of consciousness is the change in status of the stick is bent propositional conceptual content from being endorsed as reality to being rejected as mere appearance. His surprising claim is that this element of experience, the unmasking of what one had taken to present reality as it is in itself, as in fact a mere appearance, a representation that's a misrepresentation, that's the centrally important aspect of experience, not the new perception that leads one to endorse the claim that the stick is straight. That new object, that is, the conceptual content we're led to endorse, indeed prompts the experience of error. But if we focus on the event that contingently occasions the process that is the experience, he's saying, we'll miss what's necessary and essential to that process as he wants us to understand it. This new way of thinking about experience that he's recommending is really the major point of the whole introduction. It's what makes possible the sort of narrative that occupies the rest of the phenomenology. Focusing on the distinctive inversion of consciousness by which what was to the subject the way things are in themselves is unmasked as merely how things were for consciousness. That movement is what will give us, Hegel's readers a phenomenological insight that's not part of the experience of error of the phenomenal consciousness we're considering. The passage I was just reading continues, quote, "This way of observing the subject matter is our contribution. It does not exist for the consciousness which we observe. But when viewed in this way, the sequence of experiences constituted by consciousness is raised to the level of a scientific progression." End of quote. This shift of perspective, this way of understanding the emergence of the second new true object, is what makes possible the science of the experience of consciousness, which, remember, was the working title with which Hegel began the project of writing that would become the Phenomenology. The particular commitments, acknowledgement of whose material incompatibility initiates a process of experience, are contingent. What is necessary about that process is the acknowledgement of error and the subsequent disillusionment that it leads to. What is necessary is, quote, "the movement which is cognition, the transforming of the in itself into that which is for itself," close quote, as Hegel says at the very end of the book. At this point in our story, we understand what that movement is, but we don't yet see why it's the key to the science of the experience of consciousness. And that's the topic of the final section of this lecture. Hegel tells us that the key to understanding the significance of the change in perspective that he's urging is to think through the significance for the threat of skepticism of the role of what is made explicit in experience by the concept of determinate negation. The penultimate paragraph of the introduction continues, quote, "As a matter of fact, the circumstance which guides this way of observing is the same as the one previously discussed with regard to the relationship between the present inquiry and skepticism. In every case, the result which emerges from an untrue mode of knowledge must not be allowed to dissolve into an empty nothingness, but must of necessity be grasped as the nothingness of that whose result it is, a result which contains what is true in the previous knowledge. Within the present context, this circumstance manifests itself as follows. When that which at first appeared as the object sinks to the level of being to consciousness a knowledge of the object, and when the in itself becomes a being for consciousness of the in itself, then this is the new object." Close quote. Now, I think at this point we've put ourselves in a position to understand this final sentence about how the change of normative status a judgeable content undergoes when the subject withdraws a previous endorsement, what he's called the inversion of consciousness, is intelligible as the emergence of a new object. But what does it have to do with the attitude we should take towards skepticism? The issue arises because of the expository trajectory we've traversed. In my first lecture, I claimed that we should read the opening of the introduction as concerned that epistemological skepticism not be forced on us already by our semantics. The more specific diagnosis was that skepticism will be forced on us if we construe the relation between appearance and reality as one in which conceptually contentful representings confront non-conceptually structured representeds across what then looms as a gulf of intelligibility. I claim further that Hegel's proposed therapy, gestured at in the introduction and developed in the consciousness chapters, is to identify conceptual content with determinateness. The kind of negation that's in principle that's in play when Hegel reads the Spinozist principle omnis determinatio est negatio is determinate negation, corresponding to Aristotelian contraries, not Aristotelian contradictories, which would be understood in terms of formal or abstract negation. The determinateness of a thought or state of affairs is a matter of modally robust exclusion of other thoughts or states of affairs, those it's materially incompatible with. This conception allows Hegel to endorse another central Spinozist doctrine. Spinoza says the order and connection of things is the same as the order and connection of ideas. End of the quote. For this notion of determinateness applies equally to things and thoughts, representeds and representings. No gulf of intelligibility is excavated between appearance and reality. Determinate thoughts and determinate states of affairs are, as determinate, both conceptually contentful and hence in principle intelligible. Epistemological skepticism is not built into this semantics at the outset. In this context, there's no reason not to construe the semantic relation between appearance and reality in representational terms. But understanding conceptual content in terms of the concept of determinate negation does not just allow such a representational construal. In Hegel's hands, it makes possible a constructive analysis of the representational dimension it finds to be implicit in conceptual content. Hegel combines this fundamental aspect of Spinoza's thought, the structural isomorphism of the order and connection of things and ideas, construed in terms of relations of determining negation, with a Kantian idea that Spinoza did not have. For Spinoza did not appreciate the distinctive normative character of what he called the order and connection of ideas, which distinguishes it from the order and connection of things. Hegel's synthesis of Spinoza with Kant depends on Kant's grounding of semantics and pragmatics. It depends on Kant's account of what one must do in order to take responsibility for a judgeable conceptual content. In my second lecture, I rehearsed how Hegel's account of the experience of error, what he makes of Kant's critical integrative task responsibility in synthesizing a constellation of commitments that has the rational unity distinctive of apperception, that story underwrites an implicit practical grasp of representational purport. Downstream from Kant, Hegel's conception of determinate negation accordingly incorporates an essentially dynamic element. It arises out of the crucial residual asymmetry between the order and connection of ideas and that of things. It's impossible for one object simultaneously to exhibit materially incompatible properties, while it's only inappropriate for one subject simultaneously to endorse materially incompatible commitments. Representings are articulated by deontic normative relations, while representeds are articulated by alethic modal ones. Finding oneself with materially incompatible commitments obliges one to do something, to revise those commitments so as to remove the incoherence. It's only in terms of that obligation to repair that we can understand what it is to take or treat two objective properties or states of affairs as incompatible in the alethic modal sense. Understanding the representational dimension of conceptual content requires understanding how the experience of error, articulated in normative terms, is intelligible as the representation of objective alethic modal relations of incompatibility. Determinate negation, material incompatibility, mediates the relation between pragmatics and semantics, as well as the relation between the expressive and representational dimensions of intentionality on the semantic side. But the revelation that the semantogenic core of experience, the aspect of experience that's responsible for the representational dimension of intentionality, that the semantogenic core of experience is the experience of error, that its essence consists in unmasking something as not real, but as mere appearance, seems to raise once more the specter of skepticism. If error is the necessary form of experience, if what one implicitly discovers in experience is always the incorrectness and inadequacy of one's knowledge or understanding, then why is not skepticism the right conclusion to draw? Why hasn't Hegel's own concept of experience shown itself as what he calls the path of despair? Hegel wants to understand the relation between the two objects, what he calls the first in itself and what he calls the being for consciousness of the in itself, as one of negation. He says, quote, "This new object contains the nothingness, the Nichtigkeit, of the first. It is what experience has made of it," end of the quote. The idea is that skepticism consists in taking the sense in which the second object is the negation of the first to be formal or abstract negation, rather than determinate negation. Doing that is, quote, "allowing the result which emerges from the untrue mode of knowledge to dissolve into empty nothingness," and saying how things really are. It's an appearance, a misrepresentation of a straight stick. That is the materially incompatible commitment for which the bent stick representation was discarded, changing its normative status. The original commitment is not revealed by its incorrectness as an appearance, just as an appearance, but as the appearance of a reality. It is genuinely an appearance of that reality, a way that reality shows up for consciousness. It's wrong, but it's not simply wrong. It's a path to the truth. When Hegel says, quote, "The result which emerges from an untrue mode of knowledge must be grasped as the nothingness of that whose result it is, a result which contains what's true in the previous knowledge," end of the quote, this is so in a double sense. First, the original take on things is not simply canceled, leaving a void, as a bare contradiction of it would do. It's replaced by a contrary, a substantive commitment, one that's materially, not just formally, incompatible with it. Something positive has been learned. The stick is straight. Second, the transition from the original object to the second true object is a change of status from a propositional attitude ascribable to the subject de dicto to one ascribable also de re. Where before we and the subject could say, S believes that the stick is bent, that's de dicto, after the experience of error and the rejection of the original endorsement in favor of a materially contrary one, the very same attitude is ascribable as S believes of a straight stick that it is bent. That's the de re characterization. That's the point of the analysis of representational purport and its uptake in terms of the experience of error, which I discussed last time. The transformation of status is a rejection of a prior endorsement, but it's not just a rejection of it. In an important sense, it's an enrichment of its content, as it becomes to the subject a claim about something. The representational dimension of its conceptual content becomes manifest, albeit by its being revealed as a misrepresentation. As we saw in the first lecture, the unintelligibility of this representational dimension is characteristic of the semantically rooted epistemological skepticism that Hegel diagnoses in the opening paragraphs of the introduction. It's no surprise at this point to learn, then, that skepticism's characteristic defect is a failure to appreciate the role of determinate negation in extracting consequences from the experience of error. He says, quote, "The presentation of untrue consciousness in its untruth is not a merely negative movement, as natural consciousness one-sidedly views it. And a mode of knowledge which makes this one-sidedness its basic principle is the skepticism which sees in every result only pure nothingness, and abstracts from the fact that this nothingness is determinate, that it's the nothingness of that from which it results. In fact, it's only when nothingness is taken as the nothingness of that, of what it comes from, that it is the true result. For then nothingness itself is a determinate nothingness and has a content. The skepticism which ends up with the abstraction of nothingness or with emptiness cannot proceed any further, but must wait and see whether anything new presents itself to it, and what this is, in order to cast it into the same abysmal void. But if, on the contrary, the result is comprehended as it truly is, as determinate negation, a new form has thereby immediately arisen." End of that long quote. Only from the point of view he is recommending can we make sense of the fact that in each experience of error, something positive is learned. One of the pieces of the puzzle, and one of the pieces of Hegel's solution to it, that I hope to have added here, is the understanding of how the representational dimension of conceptual content, no less than its expressive dimension, becomes intelligible in terms of the essential constitutive role that determinate negation plays in the process of experience. Nonetheless, we can still ask, why doesn't Hegel's account of experience as the experience of error, as the unmasking of what we took to be reality as appearance, as the revelation of what was to subjects the way things are in themselves, its revelation as merely being what they are for consciousness, why doesn't that provide exactly the premise needed for a fallibilist meta-induction? The fallibilist meta-induction is the inference that starts with the observation that every belief we have had or judgment we've made has eventually turned out to be false, at least in detail. And it concludes that every belief or judgment we ever will or even could have will similarly eventually be found wanting, if we but subject it to sufficient critical scrutiny. Early on in the introduction, Hegel tells us that this skeptical conclusion is a natural one for those who have not yet learned the lessons he is teaching us. He says, quote, "Natural consciousness will show itself to be merely the concept of knowledge, or unreal knowledge. But since it immediately takes itself to be real knowledge, this pathway has a negative significance for it. And what is actually the realization of the concept is for it rather the loss and destruction of itself. For on this road, it loses its truth. The road may thus be viewed as the path of doubt, or more properly, as the path of despair. This road is the conscious insight into the untruth of phenomenal knowledge." Close quote. What one needs to learn to see that this is the wrong conclusion is the central semantic significance of the experience of error for the intelligibility of the representational dimension of conceptual content. But to understand the positive significance of the unmasking of commitments as determinately mistaken, as misrepresentations since corrected, a substantive new conception of truth is required. That conception is developed in the body of the Phenomenology and only hinted at in the introductory material. It is foreshadowed, however, already in the preface. He says, quote, "Truth includes the negative also. What would be called the false if it could be regarded as something from which one might abstract? The evanescent must, on the contrary, be regarded as essential, not as something fixed, cut off from the true. Appearance is the arising and passing away that does not itself arise and pass away, but is in itself and constitutes actuality and the movement of the life of truth." End of the quote. Instead of thinking of truth as an achievable state or process, Hegel wants us to think, as an achievable state or status, Hegel wants us to think of it as a characteristic of a process, the process of experience, in which appearances arise and pass away. They arise as appearances taken as veridical, ways things are for consciousness that are endorsed as how they are in themselves. When they're found to be materially incompatible with other commitments in the experience of error, some are rejected, a transformation of status that is the arising of the second true object. The appearance as a misrepresentation. It's becoming to consciousness only how things are or were for consciousness. This process of weighing the credentials of competing commitments to determine which should be retained and which altered so as to remove local material incompatibilities is the process by which we find out more about how things really are. That passage from the preface continues with a famous image. He says, quote, "The true is thus a bacchanalian revel, with not a member sober. Yet because each member collapses as soon as he drops out, the revel is just as much transparent and simple repose." End of quote. The truth is a vast bacchanalian revel, a drunken party. The revel is the restless elbowing of commitments discovered to be incompatible. Those that drop out are those that undergo the transformation of experience and are rejected in order to maintain the rational homeostasis that Hegel identifies as a state of simple repose. The party continues in its movement and development because the place of those that fall away is immediately taken by other commitments. This axial passage from the preface continues in a way that introduces three themes with which I want to end my discussion. Quote, "Judged in the court of this movement, the single shapes of spirit do not persist any more than determinate thoughts do, but they are as much positive and necessary moments as they are negative and evanescent. In the whole of this movement, seen as a state of repose, what distinguishes itself therein and gives itself a particular existence is preserved as something that recollects itself, whose existence is self-knowledge, and whose self-knowledge is just as much immediately existence." End of the quote. First, the truth process, whose structure is that of the experience of error, is the process by which conceptual contents develop and are determined. It's not just the process by which judgments are selected, but also the process by which concepts evolve. It's the process in and through which more and more of how the world really is, what is actually materially incompatible with what, in the objective alethic sense, becomes incorporated in material incompatibilities deontically acknowledged by subjects. For one's response to the acknowledged incompatibility of two commitments one finds oneself with often is to adjust one's commitments concerning what's incompatible with what, and so what follows from what. If my initial concept of an acid obliges me to apply it to any liquid that tastes sour, and applying it commits me to that liquid turning litmus paper red, I might respond to a sour liquid that turns litmus paper blue, and the incompatibility of those two color commitments, not by rejecting either the perceptual judgment of sourness or the perceptual judgment of blue, but by revising the norms that articulate the concept. I might, for instance, take it that only clear liquids that taste sour are acids, or that cloudy acids don't turn litmus paper red. It's because and insofar as they inherit the result of many such experiences of error that the normatively articulated conceptual contents that subjects acknowledge and deploy track the objective modal conceptual articulation of the world as well as they do. That's why the experience of error is a truth process. The second point is that Hegel's invocation of recollection, Erinnerung, to which he returns at the very end of the Phenomenology, is a gesture at the third phase in the experience of error. We've already considered the first two. Acknowledging the material incompatibility of one's commitments and revising one's commitments, including those concerning what's incompatible with what, so as to repair the discordance. What Hegel calls recollection is a subsequent, retrospective, rational reconstruction of the extended process of experience that has led one's current constellation of commitments. What's reconstructed is a sequence of episodes, each of which exhibits the three-phase structure of acknowledgement, repair, and recollection of materially incompatible commitments one has endorsed. From the actual process of past experience, the recollector selects a trajectory that's exhibited as expressively progressive, that is, as having the form of a gradual cumulative revelation of how things really are, according to the recollector. It's a Whiggish story, characteristic of old-fashioned histories of science, a story of the way things are in themselves, of how the way things are in themselves came to be the way they veridically appeared for consciousness. That in this way the past is constantly turned into a history, differently with each tripartite episode of experience, is how Hegel understands reason as retrospectively, as he says, giving contingency the form of necessity. The third point is that the recollection phase of experience is a crucial element in what Hegel calls the science of the experience of consciousness. So far in these lectures, I've talked a lot about the experience of consciousness, but not officially about the science of the experience of consciousness. And this may well have led to some puzzlement. Why am I talking about the role and experience of mundane concepts such as bent stick and straight stick, when the book Hegel is introducing us to focuses exclusively on concepts such as consciousness, self-consciousness, and agency? That is, I would say, on the concept of cognitive authority, the social institution of authority, and practical authority. Why have I been discussing the development of constellations of judgments and concepts when Hegel is concerned, at least in the second half of the introduction, with the development of what he calls shapes of consciousness? Such questions, while understandable, are, I think, misplaced. Though I've not explicitly been talking about it, what I've been doing is an exercise of the science of the experience of consciousness. For that science is the explicit, systematic, self-conscious understanding of the experience of consciousness. I take it that any understanding of Hegel, or for that matter Kant, should start with what he has to teach us about ordinary ground-level empirical and practical experience. For Hegel, as for Kant, a matter of applying what Hegel calls determinate concepts. Those are concepts like stick and straight and blue and sour. What Hegel calls speculative or logical concepts are theoretical philosophical metaconcepts, whose distinctive expressive role it is to make explicit features of the conceptual contents and use, the semantics and pragmatics, of those very ground-level determinate concepts. The Phenomenology is a story, a recollective story, about the development of those higher-level concepts in terms of which his readers, the phenomenological consciousness, can be brought to comprehend discursive activity in general, phenomenal consciousness. The measure of our understanding of what he has to say on this topic lies principally in the sense we can use those metaconcepts to make of the whole constellation of conceptually articulated normative practice and institutions that Hegel calls Geist. That's why I've started my story with what I take it he wants us ultimately to understand about the experience of consciousness. Then, and I think only then, and on that basis, we can consider what it is to render the development of either kind of concept in scientific terms, in Hegel's sense of that term. To do that is to tell a certain kind of retrospective, rationally reconstructive story about their development, one that displays an expressively progressive history made out of the past. This is the third phase of the process of experience, which is initiated by the acknowledgement of the material incompatibility of some commitments, that proceeds through the local and temporary resolution of that incoherence by relinquishing or modifying some commitments, including those concerning what's materially incompatible with or a consequence of what, while retaining others, and culminates in the comprehending of the experience by situating it as the current result of a process in which previous commitments show up as ever more revelatory, but still ultimately inadequate, appearances for consciousness of what one now takes it, things are in themselves. The capstone of Hegel's account, at the end of the Reason chapter, and further at the end of the Spirit chapter, will be to show us how this retrospective, rationally reconstructive, genealogical phase of the process of experience means that such experience is at once both the further determining of the content of concepts, whether determinate like acid or philosophical like self-consciousness, in the sense of the expressive dimension of conceptual content, that intentionality that's articulated by relations of determinate negation, and at the same time is the discerning of reference, Bedeutungen, what things are in themselves that are represented by such senses, Sinne, what things are for consciousness, along the representational dimension of conceptual content, of intentionality, as articulated by the process that is the experience of error, normatively governed by relations of determinate negation. But that's a story for another occasion. Hegel thinks that the only form of theoretical comprehension of the conceptual and representational content of a concept can take is such a genealogy of a process of experience by which it's determined. This is true whether what's being addressed is a constellation of concepts and commitments at the meta level of scientific self-consciousness or at the ground level of empirical phenomenal consciousness. That's why he assimilates them in the preface passage that I've just been considering. He says, quote, "Judged in the court of this movement of experience, the single shapes of spirit, at the meta level, do not persist any more than determinate thoughts do at the ground level. But they are as much positive and necessary moments as they are negative and evanescent," close quote. A proper meta-level account of the experience of self-consciousness is a science of the experience of ground-level consciousness. The phenomenology itself recounts the experience of the science of the experience of consciousness, the process by which meta-concepts he takes to be adequate to comprehend explicitly the process of experience are themselves developed and determined. We see Hegel asserting that the shapes of error, that the experience of error as here described is also the mechanism whereby new shapes of consciousness arise, in a passage we're now in a position to read and understand. He says, quote, "When that which at first appears as the object sinks to the level of being to consciousness, a knowledge of the object, and when the in itself becomes a being for consciousness of the in itself, then this is the new object. And with this new object, a new shape of consciousness also makes its appearance, a shape to which the essence is something different from what was the essence to the preceding shape. It is this circumstance which guides the entire succession of the shapes of consciousness in its necessity. But it is this necessity alone, or the emergence of the new object, presenting itself to consciousness without the latter's knowing how this happens to it, which occurs for us, as it were, behind its back. A moment which is both in itself and for us is thereby introduced into the movement of consciousness, a moment which does not present itself for the consciousness engaged in the experience itself. But the content of what we see emerging exists for it, and we comprehend only the formal aspect of what emerges, or pure emerging. For consciousness, what has emerged exists only as an object. For us, it exists at once as a movement and a becoming. This, then, is the necessity in virtue of which the present road towards science is itself already a science. And in accordance with its content, it may be called the science of the experience of consciousness. End of the quote. In these lectures, I focused on what Hegel will have to say about the semantics and pragmatics of the concepts deployed and determined through base-level experience by way of preparation for understanding the course of the experience of meta-level self-consciousness that he recollects for us in the body of the Phenomenology. That's what this is an introduction to. Thank you.